Dr. Lynn Rothschild is passionate about the origin and evolution of life on Earth and elsewhere, while at the same time pioneering the use of synthetic biology to enable space exploration. She wears several hats as a senior scientist at NASA's Ames Research Center in Bio and Bio-Inspired Technologies, research and technology lead for NASA headquarters Space Technology Mission Directorate, as well as an adjunct professor at Brown University and the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research has focused on how life, particularly microbes, has evolved in the context of the physical environment, both here and potentially elsewhere. Her astrobiology research includes examining a protein-based scenario for the origin of life, hunting for the most radiation-resilient organisms, and determining signatures for life on extrasolar planets. More recently, Rothschild has brought her creativity to the burgeoning field of synthetic biology, articulating a vision for the future of synthetic biology as an enabling technology for NASA's missions, including human space exploration and astrobiology. Since 2011, she has been the faculty advisor of the award-winning Stanford-Brown iGEM team, which has pioneered the use of synthetic biology to accomplish NASA's missions, particularly focusing on human settlements of Mars, astrobiology, and such innovative technologies as biowires and making biodegradable UAS drones and bioballoons. Her lab has moved these plans in the form of the PowerCell synthetic biology secondary payload on the DLR satellite, Eucropis, which launched in 2017. She frequently appears on documentaries, TV and radio, and lectures worldwide, including Windsor Castle, Comic-Con, and the Vatican. Due to technical difficulties, the beginning portion of this program was lost. We joined this Skeptical program 8 minutes into the talk.
Whereas silicon can do some interesting stuff, but not nearly as much interesting stuff as carbon can. And the thing that really I find very impressive is I have colleagues at NASA Ames and around the world who are extrasolar and interstellar chemists. And what they do is they take telescopes and they get spectroscopic readings between stars and do chemistry that way, and then try lab simulations. And what's absolutely stunning is that the sort of compounds they find out there are the same sorts of compounds that we're made out of. So they actually see things like amino acids, and certainly water, and other carbon-based compounds. And so I'm left with this sort of uncomfortable feeling that if there is life around, say, something like Alpha Centauri, these kids are using roughly the same chemistry book that those of us who are biology majors had to suffer through. It's just that it's written in Alpha Centaurian, but it's not that exotic. And, you know, honestly, if you were going to pick a place to have silicon-based rock, you're sitting on it right now. So this is roughly the composition of the Earth's crust, and you can see an awful lot of it's silicon and oxygen. I'm writing a proposal right now, due next week, and so I happened to look it up for other reasons, and it turns out over 90% of the Earth's crust is silicate. I mean, this is a perfect place to have a silicon-based life form. And much as I rely on my Mac for day-to-day living and my iPhone and everything else, I am not a silicon-based life form yet. So I would say that even on a place that it would be wholly biased towards silicon-based life, you still have carbon-based life. And so what I've done is try to get you to agree with me that ground zero is carbon-based life, and if you buy that, all sorts of things flow from it. For example, your relationship to the electromagnetic spectrum. We use this tiny sliver, and if you're based on organic carbon, as we all are, going into the UV is going to hurt your biomolecules. Yes, you need to put sunblock on in the summer. It's going to hurt your DNA and your proteins and your lipids and all that. And similarly, if you go into the infrared, there's not a whole lot of energy, so it's probably not worth basing that as on using infrared as an energy source. There are few organisms that can see in the infrared, like pythons, so that they can follow their prey and so on. But in general, we use this tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, which we call visible light. Plants, if they could speak, would call it photosynthetically active radiation. But that's our tiny slice, and I would argue that that would be true of any carbon-based life form just for physical reasons. And then we use water. Yes, water is actually the only beverage that you have to have. And it's actually really good as a solvent for a whole lot of reasons. I once spoke at the opening of a water conference in the Netherlands with all these water companies, and so I had a list about this long because I wasn't quite sure why they wanted the rest of my talk. And there are a whole lot of reasons that water is a great solvent. But two things I want you to take home is that, first of all, it's liquid at a pretty high temperature. So if you start to get into liquid methane and ethane and all these other exotics, they're liquid at a very cold temperature. So if life is going to use those, it's going to be working at a very, very slow rate compared to using water. And then the other thing that's really cool about water, for those of us who have had drinks with ice in it in the last hour, is you may notice that water is unusual in that when it's solid, it's actually less dense than when it's liquid. And so that allows you to have floating ice cubes in your gin and tonic. But better yet, it means that you can have ice-covered moons with liquid water underneath them, like Europa and Enceladus and so on, which then provides more abodes for life. So if you search, and by the way, there's a ton of it in the solar system and the universe as a whole, so not a bad thing. In fact, here's a picture of a solar system being formed. And the thought is that this is very much what our own solar system looked like before the planets really had formed. So this would be about 4.7 billion years ago or so. And you can see that blue haze around the edge. That would be water vapor that eventually condensed into forming these ice-covered moons and liquid on our planet and so on. The problem is, here's Titan, this moon of Jupiter, and Saturn. And the thing is that it would be a fabulous place to have life. There's tons and tons of organic carbon chemistry, more than on Earth. And these lakes actually are organic carbon lakes. They're not water. But it's this ethane-methane problem that it's so cold that I don't believe that you would actually have life there. But boy, I realize there are a lot of skeptics, well, obviously, Skeptics Conference in the audience and humanists and so on, but I do occasionally lecture to the Vatican and so on, and so I always tease them when I say that Titan has been placed in our solar system to test our faith in liquid water, and that they understand. So there you have, we have an operational definition. So basic carbon chemistry, you've got the environment that provides all these pressures. You can only go so high in temperature because you're going to keep your organic carbon there, and only so low because the water's going to freeze, and only so much radiation because you're going to damage biomolecules. So you start to build up this multi-dimensional niche space for life if you buy my original arguments. And again, you notice none of them are based on something that would have to happen here. They're based on generalities. Natural selection. The NASA definition includes natural selection. You will work hard to find someone who is a bigger Darwin fanatic in the room. I've always booked on February 12th. But the fact is that you could come up with any bizarre mechanism for evolution, and there is probably some beetle in the rainforest that does it. It's not the only game in town. The dinosaurs could not have out-evolved the asteroid that hit 65 million years ago. It was just the ultimate bad hair day for them. So there are things that do happen. But natural selection, you're going to look similar to your parents. Not all your offspring are going to survive, and so on. That's your basic strip down, and that happens an awful lot. Not personally, you personally. So you've got all these sort of things for this operational definition. And what happens is that gives you a fair amount of predictive power to start to get an idea of universal concepts for life. So let's try just a little bit more chemistry and look at amino acids. So these are the building blocks of proteins. As I mentioned, we find them even in the interstellar medium and so on. If you look at the 20 or so amino acids that we use, and then you look at different potential sources, abiotic sources, so sources for them that don't involve life, you find that they end up in a pecking order. So this is a figure out of colleagues of ours in McMaster, Paul Higgs and Ralph Pedretz, published a few years ago, which I absolutely love. And you look here, meteorites, stardust, ice analogs, prebiotic experiments, hydrothermal syntheses, and so on. You get this pecking order where you get much more glycine than anything else, and then alanine, and then aspartate, and glutamate, and so on. And so again, that looks like abiotically, you're biased towards certain amino acids to start with. Can you then start to make peptides abiotically? Sure you can. There are lots of ways to do it. Actually, this proposal I'm working on right now is with a professor in San Diego State who thinks he has a mechanism to start to form peptides on silicates. And I just told you the Earth's crust is over 90% silicates, so what a great sort of combination. But here's another study that was done, which I think is great, impact synthesis. Could you imagine you've got amino acids on a meteorite or a comet, it slams into the Earth, and that's shock alone is enough to synthesize short-chain proteins. You don't need to have a ribosome. You don't need to have all the complicated accessories that we have. So there are ways to start to build, to make these amino acids. There's a way to start building these into short proteins to get to an origin of life that could happen anywhere. But we use longer polymers, and it turns out lipids can be made abiotically, and they can form these little vesicles abiotically. You can go home and do it yourself tonight. Just shake some oil and vinegar or oil and water, and you get little vesicles. Sure, that's easy. That happens everywhere. I just told you that amino acids can form short proteins. Lots of ways to do that abiotically. RNA, the molecule that interfaces with DNA to help make proteins, and now we've discovered has lots and lots of other functions in the cell. The basis parts of it are found in abiotic settings. The whole nucleotide, we have potential ways to make them, but we don't just find them out there. But once you've made those, and there's still a question of how you actually do that out in nature prebiotically, you can do polymerization pretty easily. Like our colleague at Santa Cruz, Dave Deemer, has done this where he's taken these nucleotides and put them around little geysers and hot springs. And with the heating and the wetting and drying, you start to get these long chain polymers up to about 100 or so of these bases. So you can actually synthesize RNA just from this heating and drying in the splash zone around a geyser. So again, all these things are not based on our life form or something special about planet Earth, but you can go a long distance towards what we actually are made of completely abiotically and agnostically. DNA is not so easy, so we won't discuss that today. So if we replayed the tape, would we still be organic chemists? And sorry, I'm still recovering. I gave a talk at Yale on Thursday, which is where I was an undergraduate, and I had not actually walked into the building where I'd taken organic chemistry in decades, so I'm still a little shaking when I say the word chemistry. But the question is, if we replayed the tape, would we still be organic chemists? And I would say yes. These discoveries in astrochemistry, the amount of carbon around in the universe as a whole, its abilities, the fact it's out there, and the fact that we are not made of silicon in a place that should be biased towards silicate-based life forms, makes me pretty confident in saying that if there's life anywhere else, it's also going to be based on organic carbon chemistry, and so its fundamental chemistry is not going to be unlike ours, and therefore we have certain environmental constraints and so on. So, if you've gone with me that far, when do we get into the antennae and the cool stuff, Lynn, the 15 eyes and the green, wings and all that sort of stuff? So that's the question of the second part. How does life actually evolve? And here we do an argument from something called convergence. So can everyone recognize this? a cactus. This one's hard. It's really good. This one's harder. Whistling thorn acacia. How many people got that right? I did a lot of field work, and I'd never go anywhere without my camera. And here's your last test. Yeah, someone's just said it there. It's the rear end of a porcupine. And all these pictures translate to exactly the same message in nature. Don't eat me, you will be sorry. Right? So, but all these organisms figured out this message, don't eat me, you'll be sorry, using spines completely independently. And that's convergence. And so when we see this, it gives us more confidence that it would happen other places or again on the Earth. It's sort of like the evolution of wings. We've got bat wings, we've got bird wings, we've got pterodactyl wings, we've got insect wings. These are unrelated. Wings seem to be something that can come up periodically. So I'd like to spend most of the rest of my talk on what I like to call great moments in evolution. Yes, I've been told I should write a book called Great Moments in Evolution. And here are a couple for you that we're going to talk about a little bit, trying these arguments from convergence to see how much of that might have happened multiple times. So let's start with metabolic pathways. Photosynthesis, could that happen again? Well, when the argument is that if you're going to use organic carbon chemistry, there's all this, primordial soup around to eat, at some point, you're either going to run out, or if you figure out how to make your own dinner, you're going to be at a competitive advantage. And that's what autotrophy is all about, taking CO2 from the atmosphere and making your own dinner. And photosynthesis is a specific form of autotrophy because it's powered by the sun. Is there energy from the sun here? Sure. Would that be true of many of these places we're looking? Absolutely. Lots and lots of power available. So if you combine the two, you got photosynthesis. It's a great idea, but let's try these arguments from convergence. Well, I've just said that you would likely have solar energy, not necessarily, but likely if you're going to be fairly close to a star, you could even potentially have enough light energy from something like a hydrothermal vent if you were deep underwater. But many places you're going to have the energy in the form of light and lots of inorganic carbon. So things like carbonates or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, potentially even CO2. But what about the biological parts? Well, you need to be able to take this light and turn it into chemical energy. You need to be able to reduce compounds, and you need to be able to carboxylate. So that's actually taking the CO2 and putting it on another enzyme. So would these happen again? This is a picture of what the solar radiation flux is like on the Earth. We only use a minuscule amount of it, life on Earth, for photosynthesis. Tons of it. So we could go much further out and still have available light for photosynthesis. What about life harvesting compounds? Of course, the average salad that you ate today probably uses chlorophyll as its light harvesting compound, but it turns out there are a couple of other compounds that are completely different that can also be used for light harvesting. And the point of showing you the actual molecular structure is not to have you memorize it or say, well, what about that second carbon? It's just to show you very visually that these all look very different. And in fact, they all arose independently as molecules that could harvest light energy and turn it into chemical energy. What about reductants? Well, it turns out there are lots and lots available. Plants use water, but there are lots and lots that bacteria use. What about these enzymes that can actually fix the carbon? Ribisco, which is short for ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate carboxylase oxygenase, which trips off my tongue because that's what I happen to do my PhD on, is the big one. It is the most prevalent protein in nature. But it turns out there are about 18 carboxylating enzymes, and I have a very strong suspicion that a lot of them arose independently. So the ability to take carbon dioxide and put it on something else seems to have arisen multiple times. And so if you use these arguments from convergence, every component of photosynthesis has arisen multiple times and would likely to be other places. You think, well, and the evolutionary pressure's there, maybe it does occur over and over. What about symbiosis, two organisms living together? Well, it turns out that's how we ended up with our types of cells, with eukaryotes. And what we believe happened was that there was a cell that took up something like an alpha proteobacterium, and that ultimately became our mitochondria. And also, some of them took up cyanobacteria, which, if you're very old like I am, they're blue-green algae, is how we grew up thinking of them. You end up being photosynthetic. And it turns out some of these took up another endosymbiont, and then you ended up with these red algae and more endosymbionts, and you end up with things like the cryptomonads, which is a group of algae that I love. And then you get a reduction, and you end up with these things happening over and over and over, actually, out in nature. And this isn't even talking about multicellular organisms like corals that then take up symbionts. So this ability to combine forces to do something new is something that happens over and over again. You know, someone comes up with a great idea like photosynthesis, everybody wants it, and one way to do it is to swallow the guy who's figured it out. What about multicellularity? A lot of people think, oh yeah, well, I'm pretty cool because I'm multicellular. And I think you had Seth Shostak in last year. He's a dear friend of mine at the SETI Institute, and we were on a stage years ago, and one of the questions from the audience was, what is the difference between the two of you? And Seth quickly jumped up and answered that. He said, the difference is that Lynn looks for stupid life and I look for smart life. But I love this, and I remind him ad nauseum that he said that. He will never say something like that again. But the fact is that because I look for stupid life and proud of it, I have a better chance than he does. But anyway, multicellularity, it's not so great. I mean, you know, it's wonderful that we are, and we wouldn't be here and thinking and so on, but the fact is that that is not as great an achievement as you might have been led to believe. So here is a tree of life. It's a couple of years old, but it roughly shows you that at this point, rather than talking about the old animal plant kingdoms, we talk about the bacteria, the archaea, which look very similar to bacteria if you look through a microscope, but have a bit of a different molecular biology and biochemistry, and then the eukarya. And most of the eukarya are, my friends, the protists, whether you're talking about disease-causing ones like trypanosomes or different algal ones or, you know, so on. But look, they're the multicellular taxa, pretty teeny tiny end of the twig there, and that's represented there by the fungi, the plants, and my kids when they were somewhat younger, animals. So, why would you even want to be multicellular, first of all? Well, I mean, there's advantages because you're bigger, so it's harder for something that's smaller to eat you. You can move faster, you can start to coordinate your movements. You have diffusion problems if you're a single cell and you're trying to get oxygen in or carbon dioxide if you're a plant. If you're this big, massive blob, it's very hard for these gases to penetrate. But if you have a lot of little tiny building blocks, then it's much easier to do things like gas exchange. You can also coordinate your movements. You don't need to worry as much about senescence. If you're a unicellular organism and your one cell dies, that's it. If you are multicellular like us, we have cells dying all the time and replaced, and you're not noticing. You're not staying up at night worrying about cells in your fingernail dying. I mean, that's how we work. And you can also sequester your germline, which has a lot of advantages. So there are a lot of reasons you might be multicellular. So it won't surprise you to know that a lot of organisms have tried this. So what I want to do is highlight one study that was done at the University of Minnesota. Will Ratcliffe was the first author on it. He's now at Georgia Tech. He's the grad student. It was Mike Travisano's lab. And I love this because it was, and I've said this in front of Mike, it was so stupid, and I mean it in the nicest possible way. It was so clear and simplistic and wonderful. In fact, he said it was so simplistic he was sure that NSF would never fund it, and they did. So they were looking to see if you could talk a yeast cell into becoming multicellular. Yeast, you know, that you use to make beer or you use to make bread or whatever, are unicellular fungi. And so all they did was they took yeast, they put it in a test tube, they shook it up, and they sat there with a timer, and the ones that fell to the bottom first got sent to a clean test tube. And they did this about 60 passages, and by then you can start to get what they called snowflake phenotypes. Look at, oops, I'm not sure these are as bright as I was hoping, particularly with the light still on. But what you do see are these globs with, say, they call snowflake phenotypes with about 30 or 40 cells, and it seemed to be heritable. So that, I mean, it's really cool that in 60 passages you could get the evolution of multicellularity. Now, in fairness, there are people who think that yeast, actually their ancestors were multicellular, so they've done this trick with a few other organisms and it seems to work. So very cool. It's not the end of the world. I mean, it's huge advantages, but it's not that hard to become multicellular. So what about going to land, for example? If we need water as a solvent, an obvious place to be is in the water. If you're going to go out and land, you become desiccated. But could that have been convergent? Well, we know for a fact that organisms have tried to go to the land many, many, many times. And there are a lot of good reasons for that, including escaping predation. But what we think was the big impetus for moving to land for the big groups of organisms, the plants, and the major one for the animals, was that as you get warmer, a liquid gets warmer, it doesn't hold as much gas. Who cares? Well, if you're a fish and you need oxygen and your little pond starts warming up, or if you go to high altitude, you're going to be oxygen starved. And ditto if you're a plant and you need the CO2. So one way to get the oxygen you desperately need is to start gulping it straight from the air or just simply move out onto land. And so that would, again, be something that you could see happening other places. What about the evolution of human skin color? Well, here I'm going to cite the work of Nina Jablonski, who for years was at the California Academy of Sciences, and unfortunately for us, has been in Pennsylvania for many years now. And she points out skin color is an adaptation to the environment, not a badge of genetic identity. It's a response to solar radiation. And what you see here, again, is that picture showing the intensity of solar radiation around the world, and it won't take too much knowledge of humans to understand that where the intensity is highest is where you see the darkest skin. And there's a reason for this that she has identified. I think many people would immediately say, well, because you're worried about skin cancer. But she points out skin cancer is usually post-reproductive. And if we're worrying about evolution, you need to worry about pressure for something before you produce children. And so what she's identified is the fact that embryos, to form their neural tubes properly, need folate. And folate actually is sensitive to ultraviolet radiation. So the mother's got to have dark enough skin to be able to protect enough folate so that your infants can be born normally. On the other hand, we all need to be forming strong bones and so on, and we need vitamin D for that. And it turns out we get most of our vitamin D from walking outside for a few minutes every day. And so we need to absorb enough ultraviolet radiation to synthesize vitamin D, but we don't want so much that we're breaking down the folate. So it becomes this balancing act. So if you're up in a northern climate, you're in the north part of Norway, you want to have pretty pale skin because you're not so worried about breaking down the folate. You are worried about having proper bone development, and vice versa as you go to a high UV environment. So the argument would be is if you're using those sorts of compounds, you know, things that are sensitive to ultraviolet or need ultraviolet for synthesis, that's going to help determine your pigmentation. What about the evolution of intelligence? And I don't know if it was pointed out, I think I took that out of the intro. I'm a microbiologist, if you haven't figured this out by now. I love, my dad used to call little wiggly things, algae and protozoa. So what am I doing talking about intelligence? Except that's my daughter getting her degree. So I have intelligent children, I like to think at least. Why would you want to be intelligent? There are lots and lots and lots of organisms on planet Earth who don't have anything that we would recognize as intelligence. And they are perfectly happy. You know, your average mushroom is not sitting around thinking, if I could only read Shakespeare. Why does anything want to be intelligent? Well, one thing is that you get better sensory ability if you're a prey, and if you're a predator, it's a really good way to be able to hunt down prey. So think about lions and gazelles, for example. It also, we think, was our strategy as Homo sapiens for dealing with a highly variable environment. If you think that we could outrun having an environment change very rapidly by growing fur and losing it and doing all these, gaining and losing fingers, yeah, I mean, some organisms do things like that, or hibernation and so on, but our strategy as humans, as Homo sapiens, was to develop a big brain. So we have the capability to write Shakespeare or Mozart or whatever, as well as figuring out how to light a match, as well as building fire. And my agency, everyone here I'm sure knows we're going back to the moon in the next couple of years. So we can do, I'm required to put that in every talk now, Artemis. You do know that Artemis was Apollo's twin sister. That's why, because we're now going to have a woman as well. So, good reason for intelligence. But are we the only game in town? So if we can do a quick divergence to mammalian phylogeny here, I take you back to the early Cretaceous, about 125 million years ago, and you notice the continents were somewhat shifted to where they are today. If you look at the major mammalian groups based on DNA sequences, the basal group there, the Eutheria, then branched into the Atlantogenata, meaning born around the Atlantic Ocean, and the Afrotheria and the Xenarthra then split about 103 million years ago there, and the Afrotheria, which we still see today, include things like, obviously, elephants, hyraxes, manatees, aardvarks, tenrecs, golden moles, elephant shrew. By the way, are there other gardeners in the room? I noticed that the mole and the gopher repellent says also good for armadillos the other day. I'm not sure whether they thought about that when they started selling that in California. Anyway, armadillos, all these things. Okay, so those are Afrotheria. Xenarthra, the armadillos, anteaters, and the sloths. And then we've got these Boreoeutheria, the northern true placental mammals, a lot of things that you're used to. Here, the Archaeoglyres, things like rodents, lagomorphs, which are things like rabbits, tree shrews, and primates. And then the Lauraceatheria, the shrews, pangolins, bats, whales, carnivores, even-toed ungulates, and so on. So that was an awful lot, but I went through that for a reason. So let's look at where intelligence is found. Us, of course. Dolphins. Elephants. Very different branches. So it looks to me like that's convergent. And if we weren't going to be quite so mammalian-centric, there certainly is some evidence for intelligence in birds, and I would say the cephalopods as well, things like octopus and squid. Has anyone here ever actually spent any time with an octopus? They are incredibly intelligent, aren't they? Like when I was a graduate student, actually at Indiana, we had some in a tank that you're supposed to then show the students. And you put a top on, and then there was a fish or something in another tank with a top. You come in the morning, and there's this trail of water, and the fish is gone. It's like, excuse me, oh, I didn't do it, Of course you did it, How stupid do you think I am? So anyway, there's intelligence of convergence in intelligence, but also fossorial mammals, mammals that burrow, and there's my arch enemy number one, the pocket gopher, the mole, and the golden mole. Again, completely convergent. What about even ant eating? That's highly convergent. It turns out that's not a bad strategy to eat ants in life. Can we use an experimental approach? Can we start to use tools like synthetic biology? What is synthetic biology? It's just the design and construction of new parts not found in nature. It's Sunday. I hate to be as pedantic about this as all that, so here's a good summary for you. So we could do that. We could test, using the tools of synthetic biology, the art of the possible, With science, we look at what actually happened. With engineering, we can start to explore things that may have happened elsewhere and we don't know about, or may never have happened, and see whether it's feasible. Will we make life de novo someday? I absolutely believe that we will. Of course, it depends a little how you want to define life, but we can make the building blocks. We can put these things into little lipid vesicles. We can get them to make proteins. And when I say we, even my lab's doing this sort of thing with undergraduates and graduate students. Is that actually life yet? I'm hesitant to call it life yet, but I think that we're on that trajectory. But I want to make a point here, because I think that the average person out in the street, not any of you, but the average person thinks the big gap in biology is between microbes and humans. But that's not true. The big gap is between non-living matter and life. There is no such thing as a simple organism. I firmly believe that that will be written on my gravestone as my gravestone. There is no such thing as a simple organism. Life is very complex. So will we make it someday? I absolutely believe we will. I think that's going to happen before we find it elsewhere, and it'll help inform our search. So I asked you to indulge me in this question of, is there a universal biology? I went through a lot of stuff that was pretty academic here. But I think that in broad outline, the fact that we'd be made out of organic carbon, and then you can start to follow certain trajectories. If you are using water, do you need this and that, and where would you live, and certain other aspects that might well happen again by these arguments from convergence. So this was the tagline. This was to get you to come back from lunch. Would aliens actually look like us? And I leave you with that thought so you can make up your own mind. Thank you very much.
We do have time for some questions.
This is most unlike me to leave time for questions.
And the first hand I saw was actually back here. There's not going to be time for all of the questions.
So I have seen the argument that convergence itself is a local phenomenon. These are organisms in the same environment using that same toolkit, genetic toolkit. So of course they pull the same tools out to adapt to changes in the environment. Can you argue that convergence is something that we'd see on different planets?
Let me go back to that example of the thorns. The toolkit that the porcupine used to make thorns was a totally different toolkit than those plants used to make thorns.
But the human skin tone would be a bad example in this case, because we're all using that same genetic flip.
That is true.
Skip.
But so that can be true, but it doesn't have to be true. You can still argue from convergence. So the local toolkit would certainly apply to the skin color, because you're going back and forth the same toolkit. And what I'm trying to say is, for something like forming spines, you're using totally different toolkits, and you're still coming up with the same physical response. And organisms come up with different responses as a way to protect themselves from ultraviolet radiation. We use melanin. There are a lot of secondary compounds that plants use. There are other things that other organisms, but they're all coming up to a solution. Too much UV is going to hurt me. So I'm saying it's not one or the other. Both happen.
Yes. Carl Woese worked at Illinois.
He certainly did.
And you seem to take the point of view that the archaea are not truly an alternative life form that might be a starting point on another planet. I don't know if those two statements I just made were connected.
I think it was a little unfortunate that the word archaea was used, because there was a universal common ancestor, which shorthand we call LUCA, last universal common ancestor, and then something before that, which there could have even been multiple forms of life. So I don't believe that anyone at this point thinks that all life arose from the archaea, that there seemed to have been a branching very early. So no, I'm a great admirer of Carl Woese, don't get me wrong. And they are very distinct metabolically, but I don't believe that they were the ancestral life form.
Okay.
How do you think about how we ended up with different chirality, D sugars, L amino acids? Was it
Oh, I'm
a
glad you asked.
50-50 chance and one just got selected and everything cascaded from there, or?
All right, if you don't mind, let me backtrack a little so that other people understand what the question was. If you have certain complexity in a molecule, you can end up with chirality. And the best way to think about it is having molecules that are right and left-handed. So we use left-handed amino acids in our bodies, and we use right-handed sugars. And the question here is why. And this is a really great question. I would love to make a mirror life form someday because there shouldn't be a reason not to. But why do we use that? One obvious idea is that it was a frozen accident. That you start to develop a polymer and you want to have the same chirality so that you can get the helixes in DNA and you can get this secondary and tertiary structure in proteins and so on. So maybe that was the one that started, or maybe that was the life form selected. Another really interesting idea is that there could be a bias in our solar system from circularly polarized light, so that there's actually more of one precursor than the other. It's not 100% one or the other, but that there may be a bias towards right-handed sugars and left-handed amino acids. Which, the reason I love that is it gives you predictive power then to go to other solar systems and also to say then within our own solar system, you're more likely to have the same chirality that we do. So as far as I know, that's currently the best state of the art. And again, don't keep getting back to this proposal, but one of the questions that I was asking is, yeah, if you can do this polymerization on silicate, is there any chiral selectivity because of silicate? But what I just gave you is, as far as I know, the state of the art today. I wouldn't hide anything from you. Is that sort of the moderator equivalent of the hook to?
We're going to take the one last question of the first guy at the microphone, and Lynn will be around for other questions. So.
You didn't talk about panspermia, but what do you think is the likelihood of larger units of life, like single cells or something like that, traveling from a planet to another planet? Is that a possibility?
Okay, so yeah, it's actually something of great interest to me. We do know that rocks can go from planet to planet. Everyone remembers the story of the ALH 84001, the Mars meteorite that was announced, and that's a funny story that I won't tell you on. It was announced the same day that Dole won the nomination from the Republican Party. That was not, as it turns out, a coincidence. Anyway, the fact is that we do know that we have meteorites on the Earth that came from Mars. I don't know if there are any confirmed ones from Venus, but there is that kind of interplanetary exchange of material. There are some people who think that dust particles could conceivably go from place to place. We know comets can, and so on. So the question is, could you get a life form ejected from a planet in one of these vehicles, make it the amount of time it would take to get to a new place, survive impact, and that's the beauty of the dust grains, is that you don't have the harsh impact. But again, the meteorite, as it goes through even our atmosphere, it's the outer fusion shell, the inner parts can stay frozen. And then walk out and say, yeah, this is a planet I like, and start to divide and not be eaten by something else, and be able to move from there. And I believe that every step in that is possible. I think that one of the great issues is the transit time, because the longer that you're without any sort of metabolic activity, the more you're accumulating damage. Now, if you were in a comet where there was melting and freezing, you might be able to last longer. The original ideas in the panspermia were talking about solar system to solar system, and I'm very concerned about the distances then and the amount of time it would take. So that's my feeling on panspermia, that with locally, it's certainly plausible, but we have no examples that have been proven of that.
All right, please give Lynn another round of applause.